Hi, my name is Jane Debevoise, and it is wonderful to see you all here. I am so thrilled to have my friend Sim Chi Yin come and talk to us. It's really very exciting. Age Art Archive, for those of you, and I assume many of you probably wouldn't know what we do. Age Art Archive is a nonprofit organization based here in Hong Kong under the rubric of Age Art Archive in America. But our mothership, as I'd like to say, is in Hong Kong. We were started in Hong Kong in the year 2000. We're a library open to the public, free of charge, just like we are here. Not a lending library, like a reading room. And we also are an archive. We have a vast digital archive of primary materials about recent art from Asia, and I can tell you what that means. We also do talks like this regularly, both in Hong Kong and here. We also have an office in India, a nonprofit organization in India, Asia Art Archive in India. We welcome you to all of this. We welcome you to come back. The format of tonight's event will be a performance of about 30 minutes by Tien, and then we'll have a conversation or a response by Tao Li Goff, who we are utterly delighted to have here. We're just meeting here for the first time, but again, there seems to be a lot of connections that go back. And then what we want is 10 to 15 minutes of conversation, or Q&A or questions. We want responses. I know that Chien wants responses. This is your first lecture performance in New York?
In this form, yeah.
In this form, and she'd love your feedback. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and if no one asks any questions, I will call on you. Okay? So start taking notes now. I'm going to abbreviate. It's true. Anybody who's been here knows that it's true. I will abbreviate the bios because they're on our website and there are other places as well. But Sim Chi Yin is an artist from Singapore who's exhibited in solo shows, biennales, and triennales. Most recently, the Istanbul Biennale in 2022 in obviously in Turkey in Istanbul. Currently, she is in New York as a fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program. How many people are from Whitney here? Yes, we have quite a few. See? Thank you for coming. Chien was commissioned as the Nobel Peace Prize photographer in 2017. I'd love to know more about what that means, but not right now. And your work has been widely collected, including in M+, which is where, in Hong Kong, which is where I was just happening, but also in other museums of great historical note. Tao is a writer, theorist, and interdisciplinary artist specializing, I abbreviated your bio, in colonial histories of race, climate, and sound technology. Tao got her BA at Princeton and PhD at Yale, and is writing a book called After Eden on how climate crisis is a racial crisis. She also works in art and sound design and is a member of New Inc., an incubator for art and technology led by the New Museum in New York City. Tao is the executive director of Afro-Asia Group, an organization that focuses on intersections of African and Asian diasporas, futurity, I can't even speak English, and coalitions. Thank you very much to both of you. Chien, you're going to start off. We're going to turn off all the lights. You want it very dark around here. And then we'll come back for the discussion with Tao and then conversations. Thank you very much.
一个吗？干啥了？不喝。对，我们都按没有亲戚也没有，咱们就是感觉走，对不对？我一般也不开。开了就觉得。就是我问了无数人怎么走，他们都说就那么走，但是来，看老半天你也不知道怎么走。来，给我手机拍。没有，1、2、3。可以吗？可以，很美，这是有脸了，有脸有面。这就是那个网红的那个洞。为啥他非要看到脸？你看，我觉得这样挺好的，一种美相。看呐，这已经是美少女的状态了。这个就是网红的那个洞，我认为它就是那个隧道。对，是。你好像你个摄像头还是什么对着我们呢？你看，就这个几分钟要往回走的人凑过分这个吧，快点，来，每人在这里留影一张，来，给你看，来，每人留影一张，来，对，来，每人，不要吵起来，阿青走的感觉懂吗？这有点密，光到那边去拍吧。没有啊，还可以，还可以啊。外面是可以。嘉春在干嘛？上班呢。我说我害怕我发去他急。急什么急？急什么？没事，走吧。他们在这里拍什么？春静，他们在这里拍什么？谁呀？那2个人。哦，吓死我了，我以为是个人呢。我以为是个雕塑。哦，原来是这样拍才漂亮。看到没有？你们要这样拍。今天葛红这个衣服穿得好。我都不知道的。看，从时光的隧道里走进。真的是时光隧道。这真的是好久好久以前了。我以为是个雕塑。他们也在拍什么？真的。日本有一个什么叫做青金峡的地方啊，它就是专门在这个入口处弄几个这样的半圆形的洞。哎，小吴，过来，那你这里你这样拍我好吗？这边拍。可以拍这个剪影嘛？对。看得到吗？
2 years ago, I gave birth to a little boy. A day before the peak of COVID-19 deaths in London. A time when they were issuing no birth, but just death certificates. It was traumatic for all of us. But perhaps nothing like what you had experienced in your time. I gave him a part of your name, the Yi that you had used in your pen name when you wrote those anti-colonial editorials and speeches. Resolute, firm, tenacious, determined. Yi Wei. I wonder what else he inherits from our past. what he carried with him into the world, what he will take into the future. What of my excavating the stories of you and your compatriots, the stories of struggle, destruction, sacrifice, idealism, and conviction did he get in utero? What of my digging in the colonial archive in those final months of the pregnancy was he exposed to? What transpired through my skin into his? What echoes? Does history write itself in a line or in circles? When the family laughs nervously about how your genes skipped a generation and passed on to me, maybe they weren't joking. There was never a photograph of you in our home or any of your children's houses. For years, I wondered why they never spoke about you. Why does Grandma's gravestone not bear your name? Did they really forget? Could they? Malaya, the war that was never declared. The British called it the Malayan Emergency so they could keep insurance policies covering the all-important rubber and tin commodity supplies from their prize colony. Local leftist communist guerrillas took to the cities, plantations, and jungles to take on the colonial and Commonwealth forces between 1948 and 1960. This war precedes America's war in Vietnam in important ways. The use of Agent Orange as a defoliant was piloted by the British in Malaya, and the tactics of resettling the population to starve the communist fighters of food, men, and medicine were also first trialed in Malaya. Later in Vietnam, this was the infamous strategic hamlets policy. Malaya was in fact the longest conflict the British fought overseas after World War II, but it is barely memorialized in either the former metropole or post-colonial states of Malaysia and Singapore. How then to remember, re-articulate this war? Restitute the missing pieces in the official and necessarily colonial archive? Can one cast a disobedient gaze over that which is in the colonial archive? Or at least shine a light that reveals the indexicality of the colonial archive? A light that also transforms the colonial prints into new scenes, new access points, new imaginaries. Can we unsee the colonial gaze? Can we remake the materiality of the archive itself? Can we revert them to the glass negatives and daguerreotypes of old and subvert the technology that accompanied the imperial enterprise? Can we use the master's tools to try to dismantle the master's house? Whose bodies do we see? Whose bodies are foregrounded? Which bodies are rarely cited? What words are used to describe the yellow and brown bodies? Do they elevate, subjugate, or re-perpetuate violences? Whose bodies are missing, captured or uncaptured by the imperial shutter, or photographed post-mortem, and then destroyed or hidden, only to re-emerge on eBay? What happens in conflicts where the camera was rarely in the hands of the so-called losers? How can we get to the moment before the imperial violence? Can we get it from the land where the tin deposits have thinned, where the smells of blood and firearms have long evaporated, Do the jungles, lakes, and elephants inherit traces and become some kind of an unspoken archive? Can we re-see this landscape and find in it potential histories? What do these spectres conjure? Or can we counter-archive this war through the objects that were trophies to the colonial army, but tools of survival to the local anti-colonial fighters? Can we extricate the familial from the colonial? I never met you. The family from the time I was a child never talked about you. I pestered Dad and his older brother about you. They never wanted to talk, even, or perhaps especially, after 60 years. One Lunar New Year on my visit home, my mom handed me a black and white photograph. It was of a man with thick lips and a high forehead, standing hands on hip, and a camera was slung around his neck. There had been another photographer in the family. I was intrigued. Eventually, oldest uncle coughed up a letter from August 1990. It was one of many letters our relatives in China had written to us. We never replied to them. Grandma had ordered your 5 children to forget you. I called the only phone number in the letter and introduced myself as your granddaughter. They thought I was a cheat and tested me by asking me to name your 5 children. I asked to visit and found myself on an improbable journey into your pasts. I got on a bus and rode 7 hours north from Hong Kong to modern-day Maysian City. These roads did not exist when you were deported by the British from Malaya. I retraced this route by land, stopping at the jetty that great-granddad had left China from in the late 1800s, and the one you landed at when you returned in early 1949. I met our relatives. I found the house that great-granddad had built and where you had lived when you returned, before you took to the hills to join the local Chinese Communist guerrilla army unit fighting the Civil War. I looked for traces of you in this 100-year-old house, where our distant relatives still live, farm, and gamble, and sometimes eat boiled rat for breakfast. I was confused, guilty, and speechless when I saw the 3-meter-high monument built to commemorate your martyrdom for the Chinese communists, and your grave tablet at its foot, which bore the names of your 4 faraway sons. There was no other trace of you here. It had been 62 years, and no one in your immediate family had returned before. I started piecing together the fragments of your life, trying to make sense of why you had become taboo in your own family. A relative ran into one of the rooms in the old house and thrust a tattered photograph into my hand. He said it was the only thing you had brought back with you from Malaya. It took me a while to comprehend. It was your prison photo. It bears your detainee number and your name romanized into English. I have seen many others since in the archives and from interviews I have done. It seems the British had every deportee photographed and inoculated against smallpox before putting you all on ships back to China. Your eyes seem to have lost the luster they once had. For another 2 years, your family did not know you were already dead. I looked in the county archives and found a paragraph recording your role and death. Propaganda cadre, People's Liberation Army local unit. Executed July 1949 by Kuomintang Army Unit. That was just a few months shy of the so-called communist liberation. Your death was the pivot on which the family's fate turned. Grandma angrily said you chose politics over family. She never spoke about you again. I don't know if any of your children knew much about your life, about what shaped your ideas, convictions, your work, about your possible double life as an underground political activist. There were murmurs of your socialist ideals, the sighting of a pistol one day, but never a smoking gun. I looked deep in the family photo albums for some clues. There you were, in your high school volleyball team, in the front row, first from left. You seemed to self-consciously tuck your left arm far behind your body, in the shadow. We now know that hairy arm on your upper left arm was the vital clue that helped relatives identify your body from amongst the corpses in the mass grave you were left in after being executed. We now know you were a school principal in Perak and Kedah in northern Malaya from the late 1930s into the early 1940s, and then the chief editor of the leftist Ipoh daily newspaper in 1946. You penned anti-colonial editorials. One of Dad's primary school classmates remembers you making fiery anti-British speeches in their town. Another classmate later teased him about his communist father. There are no official records of your arrest, but there is a deportation list with your name on it. The British had declared a state of emergency across Malaya. You were offered voluntary repatriation in those times of overcrowded jails. Some sort of choice that was. You took it anyway. On the gravestone of a Scottish soldier who was killed in this war, it is inscribed, "One day, we'll understand." Will we?
教课的奴隶，起来，全世界的奴隶，满腔的热血已经沸腾着，最后。
International 就一定要实现。
没有错哦。
第一条是的，有编号的一条就够了。
Just been so powerful. I don't even know where to begin because I feel like I have 1,000 questions, but also no questions. in that I feel like we're on a similar journey. So thank you for sharing that with us first of all. So it's just really great to be able to welcome everyone here today, and I want to sit with the fact that we're in an archive. And you and I actually met the last time in an archive. So in the Netherlands, just before the pandemic, we found ourselves gathered to talk about the question of race and coloniality. And, you know, it was sound and vision. And there's so much here that you showed us that really resonates in terms of the materiality of the archive, what it can offer us. So it just feels beautiful to be here from archival space to archival space and to sit with what you've given us, because it's very, it's rich, it's poignant, it's difficult. It's about these hidden circuits of British Empire, European Empire, and I guess what we do with it and what we inherit. So I wanted to begin the conversation with, I guess, lines of yours that I read and had to linger with. And you once said that sometimes I wish I could attempt things less colossal. And all of this was poetry to me, and I just wonder if you would take us through that question of scale and the colossal in terms of the granularity of what you're giving us here, but also what was that yearning for in terms of attempting things less colossal.
Yeah, thank you, Tal, and thanks everyone for coming out on a Friday night. So yeah, I mean, basically I tried to condense in this 20-minute or so presentation the multiple chapters of this mammoth project that sometimes even I have trouble keeping track of now. I made a mind map that might be useful to put up, just as a way to make sense of the colossal. So this is just like is a mapping of the different chapters of the work. When I got into this work, it was really a yearning to try to understand why this person had been completely wiped out of the family history. And to see him memorialized in a physical monument in our village in this tiny part of China I was just completely floored with guilt and with, I just didn't understand why. And so I just went on this search trying to find initially answers to a family history kind of question and inquiry. But it kind of blasted open into a bigger inquiry into this particular conflict, and I think, also all the links with the other decolonial wars. And all the anti-colonial wars at the end of the decolonization, or during the decolonization period. And unwittingly it became like a 10, 12-year project. And this yearning for the less colossal is just because I'm just mired in this thing for the past decade. Not unwillingly, obviously, but it's just a lot to deal with. But you can see with the newer pieces of the work, which I kind of began the reading with. So the 2-channel film is new. It's, I think, slightly more detached from the document and the specific histories. And then also the repurposing of the Magic Lantern slides, where I'm speaking about the birth of my son. That takes us into a more speculative kind of space, I think. And that's where the work is beginning to go, because I've been grappling for the past decade with the past and the gaps in the archive, and how can I re-narrate or counter-narrate this war using what there is. And now I'm trying to find ways to go beyond the past. I find myself saying and thinking that the past too needs somewhere to go. Mm-hmm. And so I'm now interested in these transgenerational inheritances, like beyond trauma, because now it's popular to talk about trauma passing on to a third generation, but I'm interested in what else there is, 3 scratches beneath our skin, that somehow translates generationally, not just intergenerationally, but transgenerationally. And so I became interested in looking at the death of this grandfather and the birth of his great-grandson, and kind of like positing what might be the inheritances between these two. And so I'm using the lantern slides to time travel them into a kind of imaginary landscape in Southeast Asia. So the colossal is still with us, unfortunately. And yeah, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I think it's just going to run its natural course, and I think I'll know when I'm done.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear about the scale of time, so 10 to 12 years, because I think we can feel that even though it's condensed here. And I agree that there's this way in which intergenerational trauma is this key word of the moment, but I prefer to kind of deflect those questions to think about intergenerational healing.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, I guess I wonder what for you does the technology of the camera offer? Because you've had a long relationship with photography, right? And obviously there's photojournalism, there's different modes of photography, but what does the technology that has been so colonial in so many different ways, when you think about the mugshot of your grandfather, what possibility, redemptive or otherwise, do you see in that, the shutter that you talk about in terms of healing intergenerationally?
I'm not sure yet. I think, obviously I have a conflicted relationship with the camera. Well aware of its histories and its very function in this particular war as well. And so but I mean, it also happens to be my base medium. So there's a lot of me that's sort of implicit as well in this. I mean, the fact that I'm also doing this reading in the English language,
right,
also kind of is something that I reflect upon, but I feel like I can't do anything about it because as someone who grew up in a former colony, I was schooled in English and my brain became wired in OS English, and to the point where I write Chinese like I think less well than a high school student. So I wouldn't attempt to do this kind of writing in my supposed mother tongue. So it's complicated. I mean, similarly, photography on the camera. I have to use it because it's my base medium, but it comes with all these complicated questions of baggage and. For the moment, the redemptive aspects of it, I'm trying to be as free as possible in the creating. I'm repurposing, found photography. I'm using sound. I'm using film. I'm also trying to sort of break my own old ways of making, I guess, to try and find room for. I don't know if redemption and repair are too strong. I'm just kind of speculating towards some kind of other resolution, if you like, because in this war, as with many other now 60 or 70-year-old conflicts, there is no option anymore for any kind of legal redress. That's out the question. That's just out the window. It's been tried with this particular conflict, but it's been thrown out of court. And so then what other forms of redress are there? And given that I'm an artist and I'm also doing a PhD on this subject, and I kind of, in a self-interested way, perhaps come down on the side of thinking that maybe art can be some way to find some kind of redress. Yeah.
I really love that, and I guess as a disclosure, I actually spent my PhD doing similar work, tracing my grandfather's journey from Jamaica to Hong Kong. So it's like there are these hidden circuits of British Empire, and I feel like we're these granddaughters trying to trace that through photography. And it's just powerful to see the different strategies that you're using. And I guess a question that people often come to me with, which I would love to hear you kind of meditate on, is this question of permission. And I guess, where do you gain your sense of permission from? Because when I'm asked that question, I sort of say, well, I am theirs and they are mine. So I feel like it's necessary and urgent. But as you said, there are so many unspoken rules and codes about this order to forget, right, from your grandmother. So how do you grapple?
I think with my own family material, my own family archive, not really struggled with that question of consent or permission. I've just been at liberty to do whatever. I don't think I've been untrue to their story. And yes, of course, there was resistance initially from the family to speak about him, but I think there's kind of a belated catharsis and a belated, I don't know if gratitude is quite the right word, but when my oldest uncle, who is now going on 87, looks at me and says, well, why are you spending all your time dealing with all this granddad stuff? Like, what is it for? This is dead people stuff. Get on with your own life. But by the time I produce like a book and multiple exhibitions, and they're like, oh, she's really serious about this, and they're like kind of grateful that somebody's paying some attention to this history. Yeah, because they haven't been able to get to it themselves, and there isn't that distance. Their father was taken away one random afternoon and was never seen again. He still chokes up and cries every time he describes that afternoon of the handcuff. His dad getting handcuffed in the family shop and taken down that one street to this one detention center, and he never knew that was the last time he would see his dad. He still cries when he speaks about this. So I think they're kind of glad in a way that one of the grandchildren has taken it upon herself to do this work. But with other people's archives, I'm a bit more careful. Like, I went on to do about 35 oral history interviews across 5 different countries.
Wow.
Some of the people were the people you saw singing. But before we got to the singing, I did hours and hours and sometimes multiple days of oral history interviews with them about their lives, their decisions to join the movement. And then, usually we end up talking about how do they, looking back, what did they make of, what they did with their lives, basically. Some of them ended up in the, still in the jungles in southern Thailand. So they basically gave 41, 42 years of their lives to this revolution that, effectively failed. There's this repository of 35 oral history interviews that I did, and the objects that you see, the artifacts that you see from the war, the counter archive, as it were, are their things. And I'm more careful with those. So with those parts of the project, I'm almost forensic about it. I'm not taking liberties with other people's stuff. I may try to, fabulate between things they say. I may maybe in the end try to narrativize some of their accounts. But for now, it's quite cut and dry. What you see is actually what they did. Nothing was. Yeah, it was all kind of documentary. Yeah.
Right. And I feel in some way there's a way in which the future gives that permission. And I would love to hear more about, I guess, in utero, because you gave us those images, and your son's poetry, which was on the screen before, about the suitcase is rotten. So I guess could you say a bit about that sentence of his and why you chose to use those words?
Yeah, so it may not be that clear. Just revisit those slides very quickly. So some of these come from, this is a new series that I did for a commission by Autograph in London, and they basically what I did was I repurposed Magic Lantern slides from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most of them depict landscapes from Southeast Asia, some specifically Malaya, and some really just very Southeast Asian in their in the textures and in the landscape. And for me, it doesn't really matter because there's no provenance to any of these slides. But you start to see, if you look closely, a random baby starts to appear. And also sometimes there's a man who appears. And so basically it's granddad and baby Lucas who start to sort of time travel into this imagined landscape. You have to look high, he's almost apparition-like. So there's a way that this is giving me space to think about future.
Yeah.
I don't know where it's gonna lead. I don't know what the element of repair or restitution is. but I'm feeling like I'm going into a different kind of space. Some of the slides are astrological as well, that
Right.
sort of mirror, for me, the in-utero world. And so I was interested in these, they're mostly slides that were of images, astrological images captured by telescopes in England and the US in the late 1800s. Yeah, and so I'm just kind of repurposing all these slides into a kind of new narrative. Yeah, that takes us into a different kind of imaginary world.
I love that because it really sits us, or you situated us with the quote by Ocean Vuong about the spiral. And does that tie into what you're thinking about in a nonlinear way?
Yeah, I'm thinking quite a lot about how history really takes place in circular form rather than a linear form. And yeah, the form of the work, I haven't really decided yet whether it's a linear progression and animated or it's another kind of form. Right now they exist as a series of glass plates, so physically, in a physical way. But yeah, I'm not really sure yet. But I'm suddenly very interested in how history writes itself in circles rather than in a line. And the title of this new work, as you've mentioned, is "The Suitcase is a Little Bit Rotten." It's a line that came out of my son's mouth at 2 years and 4 months. And I don't know what it means. It only came out once from his mouth. But I was very intrigued because it has this idea of travel. And here we are time traveling. But then the rotten gives you a sense that there's something off about the travel somehow. So it gives you a hint that there's something off about, I've created small interventions in these images that you have to kind of hunt for. So I just kind of thought there was an absurd poetry in that one line, and I decided to use it as a title of the work. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it feels like he's a young oracle, and but this also for me feels like a kind of gosan in Hakka, is what we would call it, or like a tomb sweeping, or
Right.
a tribute to your grandfather. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you both very much. That was really interesting, and how was fascinating, and obviously, Ian, your presentation has got so much going on. So much going on that I'm a little bit frightened by the fact we only have about 10, 15 minutes here. But as everybody should know, you will be speaking and working and available to continue this conversation, and maybe we should have a follow-up at some point, and Tao as well. We have a few minutes for some conversations, questions, reflections, thoughts, feelings. I'm big into feelings. Raise your hand if you want, because I can imagine there's going to be quite a number.
I have a quick question. Congratulations, it was beautiful. I come from a different colonial history from Mexico, and I feel like at some point in your performance, you were asking these questions about coloniality. And I think for me, the answer is there's nothing you can do about it. It's so ingrained in our system that it's going to be passed on. And so I feel the power is on re-signifying those histories. And you were sort of touching upon what you do with this work in terms of the futurality of it. But in terms of re-signifying the history and making new meanings, sort of how do you position your work and your personal history within sort of attaching new meanings to it, and the possibilities of that being something that heals, whether it's a very individual process or a collective process?
Yeah, I don't think there's a clear kind of path to that, but I mean, I've really just come into this with family history as the entry point. And then at some point I went and grappled with the colonial archive. And so, yeah, I mean, the re-signifying is very clear in the series of work called Interventions, where I really created or reinterpreted the colonial photographs by, I don't know if it was apparent in the presentation, but basically I photographed these archival prints on a light against a strong backlight that caused a seepage of verso and recto into one plane, front and backs into one plane. So you can see all the kind of words, captions, nomenclature that were used. So at the very least, it's revealing the layers of indexing and naming that have gone on, and then re-signifying and repurposing and re-narrating it by almost like a DJ, mixing it and matching it and re-presenting it, and then transposing them into glass and presenting it physically. And but that work is almost never seen without the songs actually playing in the background. So I only showed you one of the two songs that I usually present. And so I think it shifts the meaning entirely when it's totally different than seeing these things in the colonial archive. So I've repurposed that and hopefully created new access points for other people as well into the work. So the family history is a kind of frame or entry point into what I hope is a work that has multiple resonances and connections with other histories from other former colonies as well. So I think it's kind of very much a work in progress.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Hi, wonderful talk. I love the archival photos. So there are these two main bodies of archival material that you're working with. The family historical archive, the photographs of high school family members, and then of course, on the other hand, the colonial. And actually, the ones that you use often at a much worse quality of preservation than the family photos. So that's an interesting inversion of the usual hierarchization of official archive as more official, more documented, more bureaucratic, and family being more sort of idiosyncratic, subjective. So I'm curious as to that intersection that you're able to find between the official, colonial, and the personal. And if I may ask, the second question is, how do you deal with that in your PhD? Someone from the academic side, there's often also a hierarchy in an academic setting of what kind of archives or what kind of material gets privileged. So in this case, the intersection is what interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a conundrum in the academy for sure. My background was in history, and now I'm doing a PhD in the Department of War Studies, but I am actually doing it visual practice based. And I am making a case that artistic intervention creates a different kind of knowledge. So I am suddenly, marshalling my case that this kind of work might not look like it's contributing to traditional historical knowledge, but I'm not trying to do that. And I'm arguing that this is a different kind of epistemology. So that's how I'm kind of framing it in the academic sense. And I really do believe in it too. I mean, I was trained properly to look at archives and basically write based on the pieces of evidence that are there, and it's usually textual as well. The text is privileged over the image as well. But I've really come to kind of question my own training, and I've almost kind of turned it on its head, basically. So I'm not interested now in evidence as such. I'm not claiming that this is the version. I'm just saying that there were these other stories, and we need to also hear them. And I am actually more interested in the spaces between the pieces of evidence or the documents that exist. I'm interested in those spaces in between and how they can be generative. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That was very elegant and beautiful and moving. And I thought when the old woman sings the International, maybe it's just because I'm terrible and a romantic leftist, but I thought it was so moving. And we had talked before about were the Malayan communists really communists or were they really nationalists? But maybe a different version of the question is, when she's singing that, what is the internationalist horizon in that? When I go into the National Archive of these insurgencies, the British clearly saw it as an international war, where they were like, oh, we did this in Cyprus, that worked. do it in Aden. Oh, this thing where we jailed people in concentration camps, like that went very well in Kenya. Let's try that, somewhere else. And so, Den Kimathi in Kenya or whoever, all these people across the world were in the same war, but they didn't necessarily realize it. So that's a boring historical question, but maybe to put it in a more imaginative, speculative way, like you were saying that they lost and it was a failed project, and that's what's moving about this woman, that it's like the mournfulness of not having this horizon. But is there, maybe they didn't lose, maybe there's something hopeful.
Yeah, I just said lost as in, in the really kind of textbook kind of sense, they didn't fulfill, a communist Malaysia in a way. So, I do think that, they were all tarred with the same communist brush, but from the interviews I've done with the foot soldiers of the movement, as I've shared with you before, I tend to think that this was first and foremost anti-colonial. And, the levels or degrees of Marxism or communism depends on who you were in the movement, what you came into the movement with and for, and what your level of education was. I mean, not everybody knew fully what communism was about. And not everyone was able to also tell me like what kind of political imaginary they had of a post-colonial Malaya. Not everybody had that. So was she internationalist? Well, I think they were aware that, the Chinese were fighting to, the Civil War. And I mean, there were definitely a lot of allegiances towards China. But I don't know if you could say that, they were internationalists in the sense that they thought about, the Soviet Union or beyond. I don't know. I don't think so. I think, I focused on the foot soldiers. So I focused on people who had not been able to write their own memoirs, didn't have access to, being recorded and filmed for oral histories before. So, it's kind of like a self-selected, less educated, less cultured group. But from the interviews I've done, I would say their anti-colonialism was very gut-based. I mean, it was very sort of like, for instance, this one woman said to me, I asked her, why do you hate the British so much? Why did you hate the British so much that you wanted them to leave? She said, well, it's quite simple. I open my door in my village and I see our children, they are dirty and they haven't had enough to eat. But you look over there and you see the white person and their children are well fed and clean. It was that simple for her. And she said, that is not fair. And we work this land. We came from China, we work this land, and we deserve something here. So it was quite simple for her. So that's the level of anti-colonialism that came forth from the kind of people I was interviewing. So did they have an internationalist vision? I don't necessarily think so. The song, the International, signified a different thing for them. For them, it was a song that they learned in the movement. They sang it every morning when they marched. They also sang it in solidarity, as a song of solidarity, as they were put on these trains and trucked away to prison. People reported hearing the International being sung as the trains went by. And then the first time I showed this 2-channel video was in Hong Kong at a gallery called Hanat in 2019. And the first thing that struck me was, it was the summer where the protests really restarted after the Yellow Umbrella movement. And as we were installing this video installation, on the street, just downstairs, people were like trying to firebomb buses. And, so there was a resonance in and outside the gallery of this kind of dream of a better political future. And the other thing to say is, one of the elderly men who came to see the show told me he was a former Malayan communist. And there are a number of them who ended up in Hong Kong. And he told me, do you know there's this one story I need to tell you? I was like, what? Please do. And he said, he said there was one particular episode where, so basically in this war, if you were caught with a weapon, you were sentenced to death. And so he described to me the final morning of this person who had been sentenced to death. And they always hang people at the crack of dawn. And so he describes the scene in the prison where this guy on death row is being marched to the noose, and he's singing the International, and the rest of the prison sings back. And then this goes on and he sings it, and he sings it, and then suddenly the song is cut. And they hear the floorboards, and that's it. And so to be told that
Amazing.
in showing this work is, I don't know, it transformed the meaning of the international piece for me. Yeah.
This,
You used the word fabulate earlier, which made me think of Saidiya Hartman's theorizing around critical fabulation. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how that line of thinking has influenced how you've engaged with the archive.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I've definitely been studying different methodologies of, finding these spaces in between and trying to make meaning. So I definitely studied her writings as well as Avery Gordon. I'm interested in these people who find ways where either there's nothing there, or there's a gap, or there's something there but you kind of want to go against it. So I'm studying all these things. I think I'm still kind of processing, how to write about it. But I think in the making, it's already kind of getting into that space of a bit of fabulation, especially with the newer chapters of the work. But yeah, I think I'm still kind of on that path somehow. I think with the Magic Lanterns work, obviously, it's departed from the document. I mean, none of this imagery has anything to do with the actual war. I'm not even trying to verify if they're actually of Malaya. I mean, the Magic Lantern images. So it's kind of like become less important to me. The storytelling and the narrativizing has become primary in that particular series, at least. And the 2-channel film that I showed initially, again, that doesn't actually talk about Malaya. That doesn't actually, I mean, it's there in the broad background, but it's not actually present. So I think the lines of inquiry have kind of, blasted open and are going down multiple avenues. And some of them are certainly not in the space of what we would traditionally call facts. Yeah.
one more question. Cece?
Continue with the last question about the source of intellectual inspirations. I was just thinking about, you mentioned the shutter. It really reminded me of the imperial shutter, which is also coming from potential history of learning imperialism. My question is, would there be any local theorists or Malay writers, intellectuals that also inspire your work?
Yeah, I've certainly been looking for non-Western sources. There are some writers who were definitely doing anti-colonial writing from Malaysia. Faris, you may be more well placed to answer this. But in terms of directly with this work, I've been looking at some Thai scholars, mostly film scholars, who write more about spectres in the land and in the landscape. So I'm engaging with art historians like T.J. Dalmos, who has written a lot about spectres, and artists, especially working on African colonialism, who also kind of grapple with spectres. And I mean, they make a case that Moving Image has this particular knack for engaging with spectres of colonialism, but I'm trying to extend that to also make a case that certain types of photography can do that. Certainly trying to diversify my intellectual inspirations and academic, sources as well. But unfortunately, the way it is, it's still so kind of predominantly Western scholars that we tend to read in the English language.
I'm going to have to stop here. I'm sure everybody has a huge number of questions still. Chien, thank you very much. Tao, we hope to bring you back so we can hear more about your work and journey. Maybe we can flip the conversation. I think it'd be really, really exciting. Your questions were really excellent. So thank you very much, all of you. And